Muy buenas tardes. Mi
Good
nombre es Ana.
afternoon. I am Anais Anderson, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this event organized by the Office of Evaluation and Oversight, as well as a part of Evaluation Week for 2022. So today we're going to be talking about the mainstream of gender, and we're going to look at some of the lessons as well and challenges. We'd like to welcome all of you from all the countries in the region. And we ask that you please remember to mute your microphone. And we are going to have a Q&A session afterwards. You can post your questions either in the Q&A or the chat box. So this is going to be recorded. And finally, I would just like to mention that the event is going to be in Spanish. So for those of you that would like simultaneous interpretation into English, Spanish, or Portuguese, all you need to do is click down the lower right-hand corner over the globe icon. Now, we would like to begin with our director, Ivory Young. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. As director of the Office of Evaluation and Oversight, OVE, at the IDB, we would like to welcome all of you to this first event that we are hosting as part of the G Local Evaluation Week for 2022. We'd like to also welcome our panelists as well as the OVE team dealing in a very, very important issue. So we're focused on just drawing attention to best practices, lessons learned, and challenges in the area of monitoring and evaluating gender mainstreaming. This has become a crucial task aimed at achieving the objectives established in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And this is basically present in every social issue, and it's why the international development community has focused on identifying various ways of incorporating gender mainstreaming in its various interventions. However, this also brings with it challenges in the realm of monitoring and evaluation. So these challenges are addressed and that require previous evaluation in any of our programs and interventions. Sometimes we have an absence of indicators, however. So we really need to focus on measurements in determining inequalities, as well as creating a body of knowledge and expertise from the various perspectives of government, institutions, agencies, civil society. From all of these areas, we need to focus on strengthening cooperation in order to implement these the evaluation and monitoring of these areas. So this is key in strengthening our body of knowledge. And we also need to contribute to a better understanding of how we can improve gender mainstreaming, incorporate these measures in our development tools so they become more effective in reducing the current inequalities. So once again, thank you very much. And on behalf of the Office of Evaluation and Oversight, we'd like to welcome you and wish you the utmost success during this event. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ivory. As was already mentioned, cooperation between the various sectors is going to be crucial in making progress. So we have a very diverse group of panelists covering every aspect. But before we begin, we'd like to also ask audience members to share your experiences in terms of gender mainstreaming in development initiatives, looking at evaluation and monitoring. Just all you have to do is send all your data to @BID evaluation GL local 2022. So we are going to also be receiving your comments, your also feedback through the chat, as well as questions. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists who are with us this afternoon. We have Karma Clavel Arca. Karma was co-director of the Gender Office, Gender Event Issues in Nicaragua, looking at issues affecting women, as well as the Human Rights Network and Women's Rights Network. We also have Alejandra Prieto, who works with inclusion and equity. Alejandra has a wide array of experience as researcher, as well as evaluator of public policy, speaker, also looking into issues of gender equality. She has been involved in the human rights arena, especially in protecting women's rights. Thank you very much and welcome, Alejandra Foundes. And we also have Alejandra Prieto, who is a specialist in planning, monitoring, and follow-up in women's issues. She has a master's in political science with more than 10 years of experience in monitoring and evaluation policies and projects. And welcome, Alejandra. And then finally, it's a pleasure to have you, Alejandra. And finally, we have Jonathan Rose, a specialist economist working with the Office of Evaluation and Oversight. He worked with the U.S. Department of the Treasury and was director in the IDB. And he has addressed many issues dealing with diversity and gender diversity and equality. Well, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us in this panel. So I'd just like to remind all of the panelists that we need to stick to a 4-minute time limit. Obviously, we would love to cover everything, but to begin, let's begin talking about implementation of gender mainstreaming. In your opinion, what do you consider to be the most important conditions and necessary in order to effectively implement gender mainstreaming, especially in modern evaluation? Thank you very much. First of all, I'm not going to give you my personal opinion. I'm going to share our own experiences based on the evaluation that we introduced in 2018. So sometimes you'll see that we've seen some progress, but then I'm going to just identify the specific factors that we have seen in our results and conclusions. There are some external factors, and we're talking about country priorities. And although at the time there was a greater interest in gender issues, the issue has sometimes taken a back seat in lending countries. So if we look at the challenges in 2019, the most important challenges were different. So first of all, we need to have in our institution, we need to have countries that are willing to tackle these challenges, and the internal factors are also very important. Here at the IDB, we've seen that leadership and commitment, political commitment in particular, is crucial in dealing, for example, having the approval of the gender agenda by the high-level leadership is important, as well as establishing well-defined concrete goals in our loans programs. This has really conveyed a clear message of the priorities within the IDB staff. Also, allocation of resources. It's important that we have specific specialists with their gender expertise, and this helped to through operations to foster greater gender mainstreaming, but it's not really evenly distributed at every level. So sometimes we need to find ways to deal and address with these needs. Another key factor that I think perhaps was even more significant has to do with technical capacities. What we have found is that there's a great deal of willingness by staff, but not enough knowledge as to how to tackle many of these challenges. So the IDB not only tried to tap into that and tap into the experiences in projects, but also we need to take the opportunity to provide greater training for the bank staff. Another key issue has to do with the integration of all of this into the institution's practices, the performance of not only in performance levels of employees, but we also found a challenge in some of these practices. We have an effective level in development that really focuses on the vertical uh, approach. And frequently, gender issues are not aligned with these main objectives. And that's why we had some that didn't focus enough on this. But now we see much more of an alignment, gender alignment in strategies, regardless of whether it is the main objective of that specific operation. And then we arrive at the key focus of today. We're looking at the monitoring priorities. Many multinational or multilateral institutions like the IDB have recognized these challenges and the results from gender mainstreaming. That's why there's been a lot of follow-up. I know I'm running out of time, but I wanted to mention that frequently we focus on counting the number of activities, but I think the IDB is now moving forward to the level where they're able to show what has worked, what hasn't worked. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for sharing all of these key points in the monitoring and evaluation arena. Now we're going to be looking at some of the lessons learned and challenges. And I'd like to just ask Alejandra Foundes, in her experience in the area of gender equality in public policies, what have been your experiences in gender mainstreaming in projects, in particular in analytical framework perspectives? Good afternoon. Yes, first of all, I would like to just mention that there are many lessons learned within the framework of incorporating gender mainstreaming and evaluation processes, not just in Latin America, but worldwide. And of course, in Latin America, we also have some unique and specific characteristics. Let me just focus on three lessons. The first one that really is associated with persistence. In 2010, we were already hosting the third evaluation conference together with all of our colleagues from the RELAC. And at that time, we worked together with Vincent, who was director of the Independent Evaluation Office of Women's Affairs. And we had Carmen Colasso, who was a firm advocate of women's rights in Argentina. So the three of us created the first panel, a conference dealing with a gender perspective inclusion. And we never imagined at the time that here, 12 years after that first event, we have more than 10 panels associated with evaluation of gender issues. So the fact that we've been able to overcome all of these barriers and obstacles, institutional obstacles in the process, I think this has been an enormous achievement, and it's the result of persistence. So I think that's the first lesson we can draw from the process, as well as our efforts in driving forward the agenda. Also, I believe that the incorporation of the gender focus and perspective really came through various levels. We look at that triad of gender mainstreaming and incorporation with looking at the reference framework that is very important in our analyses and how we can address the major changes and the transformation we've seen in gender equality. If we have the methodological framework, the instruments, the process, the terms of reference, the equipment, et cetera, and teams that are totally aligned with the operational focus. And then we also have another path that has to do with the outcomes and the results of these operations. To what extent do we use these results? To what extent do we disseminate them in terms of creating a greater gender awareness and approach? So I think over the last few years, based on my experience, I think it has to do more with the technical and operational perspectives. We've had many tools developed, many different types of training programs dealing with gender mainstream methodology, incorporating more opportunities for inclusion, and other initiatives that have been developed institutionally by multilateral organizations as well as the UN, agencies, governments, national evaluation offices, as well as the evaluators and the evaluator community. So there's a lot of interesting developments that continue to develop. These are issues where we are going to continue to revisit and they continue to help us upgrade the process. And then one final path that I think is crucial associated with development, and it's very strategic. And I'm going to ask if we could put up my slide. This has to do specifically with the analytical and reference frameworks, where we also have the standards framework in terms of gender issues to eliminate all kinds of discrimination against women. This is a standards framework that is binding on our country. So it has an enormous significance in terms of the kind of transformation that we're seeking, the types of commitments, and how various governments and also agencies, what steps are they taking to enforce these and incorporate them? So I think that throughout the history of the incorporation of new gender initiatives have achieved through various instruments that we that are closely aligned with the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals associated with we have objective number 5, for example, in terms of gender equality, and also looking at others that are associated with the goals, the indicators, and results that we want to achieve up through 2030. It's basically another 8 years before we need to fully implement these SDGs. That's why it requires an enormous amount of professional, personal, institutional effort to make that progress on the agenda. Then we also have other instruments and other tools and that also look at the 4 key pillars and structural bottlenecks of the inequality, gender inequality. And these have been, we have seen the development over the last 5 years of regional conferences on gender equality and mechanisms to promote that. And this regional agenda has been building up through diagnostic studies, analyses, evaluations that continue to provide the building blocks in addressing the priorities that governments are now tackling. That's why it's crucial that we analyze the transformation processes, as well as the need to identify what are the major lines of effort and changes that are being proposed in these projects that we're assessing. And we need to also have interpretative indicators so that we can make sure that what we're evaluating and what we're going to assess are continuously moving toward gender equality and the eradication of these structural bottlenecks. That's why I think it is so important to not lose sight of where we're going in terms of gender equality, to not, again, lose perspective and lose our way, so that we can continue to make a much more articulated and global progress, so that this will continue to guide us and provide us with our compass point, with an interpretation and analysis with the specific data, providing a much more strategic and transformative perspective in the area of gender equality. Thank you very much, Alejandra. Very important perspective. And then the next question, I think, is tied to what we're looking at in the operational context. How are the evaluations carried out with these projects? Alejandra Prieto I hope can be able to share her experiences in this area, looking at the evaluations. What are some of the key characteristics to ensure that gender perspective be closely incorporated and addressed? Thank you, Annalise and Anais, and I'd like to thank the bank for hosting this. Thank you for kindly inviting me as well. And now we're going to look at some of the tools presented by some of the strategic tools in providing gender equality. These are elements that help us focus on how we need to put these concepts in place especially those of us that work with the multilateral institutions and incorporate not just diagnostic studies, the design in the implementation and monitoring of projects, but also the development of other mechanisms. I think some of the key challenges includes the inclusion and participation of women in the design of projects where they can provide their inputs and perspectives, and also how they view some of the challenges that we're trying to tackle. And this level of participation by women needs to be incorporated in the follow-up evaluations of the projects. We believe that these are key. The evaluation process focuses again on increasing women's participation and equality, gender equality, working in unison with the human rights context that has always been underlying part of our focus and the use of these results. That it's not just presenting this in reports, but these results need to be need to incorporate the other perspectives and voices. So when we look at gender perspective, it's not just in empowering women, but it's also significant as a process that will empower and will eliminate exclusion of others. It's a tool, again, for overall gender and equality and human rights equality as well, looking at the processes, the methodologies, the evaluations that have already been discussed. And I believe that when we look at or assess a development project, we need to look to see to what extent is the program aligned with human rights that also foster skills building and development in women and address, again, human rights and identify who has the rights, who has the responsibilities as well, and provide them with an opportunity to express their voices. And not just women, but other groups that face discrimination or inequality. So we compile disaggregated data by age range, by religion, and by other characteristics. And that way, we're able to look at the differences in access to services, access to resources, and how these resources and services are being used. And it also contributes to, do they contribute to the results, to specific change? And sometimes what we ignore is that we're not sure exactly what we're measuring when we look at some of these structural bottlenecks as well. If we look at resources and assets, looking at access by men and women in terms of accessing these resources that include access to land, access to opportunities, new income that is generated, decision making that takes place in the household and the communities. We're able to examine how the communities are making decisions, formal as well as informal decisions, the level of participation, the demands in terms of resources and time, and what are the needs that we're identifying for women? What are the different roles and responsibilities taken on in the family and within the community? And how can we identify this based on gender differences, the level of female and male participation in the political processes? What are the various incentives, benefits that can encourage and promote greater levels of participation? gender participation. And we also believe that there are some resources that are directed directly at women. And because of that, that incorporates per se gender perspectives. And sometimes that's a mistake because the fact that a project is designed for women, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has a gender focus or perspective. And the evaluation per se needs to include that or should include it. Thank you very much, Alejandra, for you sharing those perspectives. And now, as we continue with the evaluation and the design of the monitoring and evaluation tools, I'd like to ask if you could, Alejandra, share with us some of the lessons learned from some of these. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, just what as Alejandra was pointing out earlier regarding some of the factors that need to be taken into account in terms of the evaluation, especially gender focused programs. I think one critical component that we need to be constantly looking at has to do with the formulation of indicators. I think that there's a great deal of justification for being more and more precise in formulating these indicators that can help facilitate the measurement process. However, we still see many problems that persist in this field at two levels. First of all, we've seen an infinite number of guidelines, training, indicator listings, many publications, and many technical efforts that have been made in that regard. But we have also seen a lot of repetitive copying. So we need to be very cautious. How many times do we see the same indicators to measure gender issues that refer to projects but don't measure things very accurately? So we need to make an effort to translate those indicators to get a better understanding. We need to have the analytical framework, of course, to understand the guide, the direction, and the objectives of these that have been proposed, but make sure that the indicators are closely related and tied to those objectives. Let me just give you an example, just what not to do as far as lesson learned. A long time ago, actually more than 10 years ago, we conducted an evaluation of gender equality policies in a large metropolitan area in Latin America. And at that time, there were different levels of interventions in reproductive health, in terms of legislation governing gender equality, also protecting women from violence. There were many, many policies that were the traditional gender policy interventions. And one of the key results of that evaluation had to do with urban mobility that was gender based. And there were a series of initiatives that included providing pink buses that were exclusive for women, also provide specific subway cars for women. And so this at the time was focusing on the authorities were very pleased with some of the results. They had seen budget increase, a significant budget increase over the last 5 years. They had a large fleet of pink buses, more safety and protection for women that were traveling using public transportation. However, when we asked them, in effect, if this was a good sign for that ministry or for that secretariat or for that initiative, was it then a good sign that the violence was dropping against women? So in the face of that, the authorities were actually dumbfounded, because most of the time that we work with public sector institutions, when they measure progress in their institutions, it's always tied to budget increases. So they thought that that was a very positive sign. with regards to changes that were being introduced in a jurisdiction or in a specific area. However, in this case, the gender issue, if you really want to create meaningful transformation in order to reduce or eradicate violence against women, you have to be much more holistic and comprehensiveness. It's not just a question of increasing the number of buses for women or improving transportation, but how is this articulated with a whole set of other measures developed within a public policy framework so that you can effectively address some of the substantive issues and break through that bottleneck of, um, of violence against women in public areas and also in private spaces as well. But I wanted to focus on, in this case, urban mobility and lack of safety and gender violence as a public policy working in a specific urban area. So I think that the indicators, it's not something we can underestimate. It's not something that we can just let it pass and say, well, we've got these indicators that we're making progress. We need to make an effort to link up these analytical frameworks, the development of indicators, the how we guide these changes, and provide these instruments so that we can look at these indicators in a much more holistic and much more comprehensive perspective and integrate the various gender inequality issues, how we're going to tackle these in our country.
Thank you very much. Yes, what you've just said is a great challenge, and it is something we have to deal with so that we can learn more about it. And now, Carmen, I wonder if we could add to this, asking Alejandra to share with us the experience and challenges that you can share with us regarding the implementation of the gender mainstreaming. Well, good afternoon, and thank you. Yes, I would like to share an experience, which is not mine. It's that of a team. We were working in Nicaragua in this case, and my case was responsible for being the gender officer in Nicaragua in the Technical Cooperation Office. And I believe that there are several things that those who've spoken before me that have to do with what we could call lessons learned. For example, the question of a political decision. What has happened often, and I think that my colleagues could confirm this, sometimes the donors have played a role there. We've said, okay, now we have to do gender mainstreaming. And that has been positive, yes, because it has led to good things, but at the same time, the sentence was added, and that's it. So it is important to consider the political framework that Alejandra was talking about as well, which we find in most of our Latin American countries. We have those political frameworks that often have no funds or trained people, but they're there, so we have to take advantage of them. And I also believe that it's important to have funds. It's important to have trained people in gender, and because just as we have people trained in other spheres of public policies, that is an area of experience and training that's required as well. And what happens is that often, and this is something I'm going to talk about later with the example of our experience with the drinking water committees, but we have to put money in to do the work. We have trained personnel. And another thing which is also very important that you also mentioned before, which is the persistence and the partnerships. Because in our case, from my experience, it's been the pressure, the training, and the social auditing of women organizations and feminist organizations in the field that have insisted on having public policies, be they of the donor or the receptor, to be implemented in our countries, as well as, like my colleague said, in global or international situations, which we could take advantage of as well. But that's fundamental. I mean, we have advanced because we've had that persistence, because there has been that feminist pressure and the necessary inputs to achieve the transformation so that the development projects can become projects that are seeking to achieve gender equality and the gender equality with the intersectionality because our Latin America is very diverse, it's very varied. And if we don't add that, there's not going to be a change. There won't be a transformation because women are diverse throughout Latin America and throughout the world, but particularly so in Latin America. So I believe that those are elements from our experience where, as donors, we had the privilege of somehow inducing, which from the point of view of women's movements have been positive, but on the other hand, we're not insisting on the quality sufficiently, and which led to training processes, for example, or preparation within the teams. Thank you very much, Carmen. And now I'd like us to talk about this particular case of the drinking water committees and the sanitation that you spoke of. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Could you share with us how they coordinated with other members of the um, local UN groups? Because I think that that was very important. I had put the alarm to remind me of the time. But I want to share an experience with you that I co authored with other colleagues in, it was called Umbrella Initiative. And it was an experience with the drinking water committees. It was the gender mainstream in that process. We had tested a large, we had approved a large project with the Spanish NGOs, but it had nothing to do with gender. Yes, I imagine, as Alejandro said, it spoke of men and it spoke of women, but there was no true transformation agenda. And what we did was that there was two of us who were working at the time and said, look, this is a wonderful opportunity. We have the funds. Let's use them. There was the political will of the Spanish and Nicaraguan NGOs who wanted to do it, and we're already doing things in the field. So we did the diagnosis of the gender gaps, and in that route of the construction of these drinking water committees, where at the assembly they decide to do it, we go to the building process, and then finally having the water source. So we had a specialist who was Clara Murialdad, who was a feminist colleague from the Spanish group, who had a great deal of experience in Central America and in teaching evaluation, who has a long history of work in the region. And we asked her for her help. We did the diagnosis of the gaps. The Spanish NGOs, together with the Nicaraguan NGOs, gave funds from the project for that, and they were supported by the technical office. And in that community route, drinking water route, we found the gaps and we found the doors so that we could achieve the transformation in that, so that the women could be in decision making levels in the drinking water committees, that the women receive the appropriate training, that if there was any position in the drinking water committees with the necessary funds, that women have access to them as well. But why didn't they access? So we realized that when there was training, they did things that was not possible for women. So these seem so insignificant, and yet they taught us a great deal in that whole process of creating equality processes. And as we identified the transformations we wanted, we were able to build in the indicators with an equality idea involved in it. Both Alejandras mentioned that in the indicator, you can develop a wonderful indicator, but if you haven't identified the gap, nor the strategy or the activity of the program and project to achieve the transformation, you're not going to be able to measure, and you're not going to be able to have gender indicators if you haven't done the previous analysis. And also, there's a sentence that we use often in Nicaragua, which I love, and that's why invent the frozen water, as they say in Spanish. There are gender indicators that have been developed from UN Women, from IDB, from feminist organizations, university professors, female professors, which means that we have to review what's already there to learn from it and to adapt them, not copy necessarily, but adapt them to the realities. And and another thing that's very important is that few good indicators that can be measured and that are timely. Because often we find that they've developed a list of indicators which are not feasible. Why so many? So we have to have good, few, efficient, and timely indicators. And then there's a whole strategy related to that. I think I'll stop here because I'm not sure if I've taken my 4 minutes or not. I apologize. But thank you for giving me this chance to be here and to share with you and to be able to hear my colleagues. No, thank you, Carmen, for telling us about this wonderful experience. And for all those who are hearing us, remember that we're sharing the links of all the resources that our panelists are talking about in the chat in case you want to go into greater depth. But now I would like to invite Alejandra Prieto to tell us from your experience in UN Women how you think you can improve collaboration between the different United Nations agencies to improve the gender mainstreaming in the projects. Yes, thank you. Of course, United Nations has a group of United Nations evaluation that has a series of products and guidelines to guide us as to what the evaluation is like and what would be the elements to add the gender mainstream into that. And UN Women also adds principles of gender equality and human rights so that there's an effective criteria to measure and to give credible and evidence-based information, as the colleague said, on what has happened with an intervention and whether it has achieved what we expect and what has been expected and unexpected regarding gender equality and women's movements. Amongst the general criteria, which are very valuable, we collect valid, objectable, and acceptable data that the aggregated sex data, that they be sensitive data, that they be adapted to the customs of the people and consider the confidentiality and the anonymous nature, because sometimes we're dealing with delicate things, and this is a very important aspect, that we have no gender biases, that we have balanced gender evaluation teams, sometimes evaluating issues that might be difficult to deal with when we're dealing with women, that we have gender balanced teams, that we include gender sensitive language, uh, participative evaluations based on human rights and gender sensitive approaches, and using normative frameworks and methodologies. But some of the experiences that we've had of joint evaluation programs of UN Women and other United Nations agencies, we find that it's very difficult to have gender perspective evaluations. And that has to do with two elements that Jonathan mentioned in saying resources. We have to have the resources sufficient for the evaluation to take place, and so that they include all these considerations in the evaluation with the necessary resources to consider all these elements. And the other is the technical capacity. Despite many efforts, as we said, there were tools, there's manual tools, there are courses and trainings, but the technical capacity to evaluate these gender dimensions are not present in all agencies. And therefore, we have found experiences where they may be initiatives working with women, they have not taken these aspects into account. So briefly, I'd like to touch on some items throughout the phases of the evaluation, the design up to the use, some little elements that might be important for the design, application, or evaluation of the terms of reference, to consider the necessary resources that I mentioned, which are essential to carry out the evaluation and add these analytical elements, and include as a criteria and as a question the gender focus and the human rights aspect, because there are often many elements left out because they're thought to be cross-cutting in the evaluation, and therefore being cross-cutting would not have a specific approach in evaluating these themes. In the execution stage, of course, to measure the power relations in the evaluation process, taking into consideration whether the process is marginating women or women's groups, and if the project can, if the evaluation process itself can really contribute to improvement of women. And I'm not going to go into this aspect because it was mentioned, the question of the indicators, but it is a very important element when doing the evaluation. And in the follow-up and utilization, I think it's important that we present the results and make an adequate use of these evaluations, adding the people who were part of the evaluation, that women, if they were present during the evaluation, be part of the reference groups or the evaluation management groups themselves, defining a plan of action to be able to implement the recommendations that came out of these evaluations, and that will definitely have an impact or lead to a transformation in the power relations between men and women. Thank you very much, Alejandra. And of course, as you mentioned at the beginning, the question of coordination is crucial for the gender mainstreaming. And in this respect, I would like to ask you, John, in your experience as leader of the evaluation of the IDB support to gender and equality, what are the main challenges that multilateral agencies face in terms of an efficient coordination for the implementation and evaluation of gender mainstreaming projects? Well, if you can put the chart I sent you, that might help answer this question very quickly. During the period from 2011 to 2016, we analyzed all the operations of bank loans and saw the gender issues that were cross-cutting in these projects. Above, you have the divisions, but that's not very important. The question is that if you look at employment and entrepreneurship, you see that almost all the divisions are mainstreaming that issue. So in the IDB group, we have more than about 100 projects that tackle gaps in the labor market. Down here, where it says LC, is the labor markets. Only one of those groups shows. So the question of channeling all the evidence, who's in charge of it? Who's in charge of collecting the lessons learned? As the other panelists who spoke before me said, what are the indicators? Are we using the right indicators and the same ones to learn the lessons? And above all, let's recall that there are lessons learned by other agencies. But I think that all that is important because in the end of the day, I think that if one can monitor and oversee all these things, we're going to have sufficient evidence showing what works and what doesn't. Many of these projects in the, for example, the transportation division, they've done some very interesting work training women with heavy machinery based on a diagnosis of how that can improve their salary, their wages. But what's the cost benefit? In that project where they trained, I think, 3 women, instead of having a national training program to train maybe 20,000. And I think that's important. Another thing I want to mention, and Carmen mentioned a very important project that we had, at least a similar one, in Bolivia with the water committees. The women's participation might improve the voice in the community, but on the other hand, it's good practices, innovation in development. In those communities, the women were the ones that had to walk for 4 hours to collect water, and those are the ones who feed the children. So the objective of the project is to improve the health and nutrition of the community. If the women are in charge and trained in the maintenance operations of this equipment, that would increase the probability of maintenance and sustainability. So we have to ask ourselves, is it necessary to really measure that? Or do we have sufficient evidence to say that the project has to be designed like that, like we do with other infrastructure projects with the new technology, taking advantage of the innovation, because we're not going to the transportation ministry and ask them if they want to use this new material that is going to last 50 years. No, it's automatically included in the procurement contract. Another very similar issue is an example that I saw in Jamaica, where we had three consecutive projects of citizen security, which was developed in time for security issues, adding the gender perspective to design the security element. And I think it's very important and something we often neglect, which are the masculinity aspects. I believe that we cannot have a citizen security project or gender-based violence projects without taking into consideration the masculinity topic. And if we start with the citizen security project, working with men who are often parents but no longer live with the mother, to teach them how they can be good fathers. That can be done with training courses, but that should improve the development effectiveness. So I leave that as an open question. Can we get to a point where it might not be that necessary to measure? Thank you. Thank you, John. Very interesting. And thank you all for your presentations. It has been a very rich discussion. And now we're going to have a question and answer session, which we've received from the Q&A. And I think we have time for about 3 questions. So let's try to shorten the answers to 3 minutes per question. First, we have a question from the public for Karma, which says, what does it mean to include the intersectionality from the evaluation perspective? Can you see me? It means, for me, that when we speak of men and women, we're not the same. We are persons with different identities, and in many cases, these are identities that discriminate against us. So I think that Alejandra Pietro said it quite clearly, be it a program or a project, it will be effective and successful as long as the beneficiaries of the program or project are part of the design and part of the evaluation as well. So depending on what project I'm going to do, let's say in an indigenous community in Guatemala, it should have that element included. It can't be a project of urban women. So it's where I'm going to work, what I'm going to do the project, and identify the diversity of the area, the colors, the discriminations, the diverse identities, which wouldn't be a problem. The problem is that those do create discrimination, and if we want transformation, we must add that, and the people must be part of the design and part of the evaluation. I wanted to talk something about the evaluation, which I thought was very important, which was mentioned by Alejandra Prieto, talking of participation. Evaluation is often seen as something that goes at the end, but evaluation is a process, really, which starts from practically the minute we begin to design a project. And then, depending on the type of evaluation, we do one or another thing, we do the process or the impact, but evaluation is always part of the process, including the program or the project that we're developing. And I'll end because of the time. Thank you, Carmen. And our next question is for Alejandra Prieto. To what extent has the gender perspective been added systematically in the institutions and governments of the region? Are there leading countries in this area? Well, I don't know if you mean agencies, governments. I'm not sure. In general, both agencies and governments. Well, I think that there has been an important effort in the development agencies, the multilateral agencies, as well as at governments to have entities dedicated specifically to generate evaluations in the country, but with the annual evaluation plans as well. I think I'm going to talk about the case of Mexico, where we have our office, where there are two entities that lead this work at a government level, which would be the Public Credit and Finance Unit and the Performance Evaluation Unit, and Coneval, which is the agency regulating public program evaluations and rules of operation, where they're making an effort to um, study these government evaluation policies and include the gender perspective involving the National Women's Institute, of course, which is the mechanism for women's rights defense, and some multilateral support agencies, thinking that it could be an integrated effort to achieve a policy that truly responds to the equality and improvement of women with the necessary guidelines that go from the design of the projects, programs, or public policies to add this perspective so that when doing the results evaluation, it be an evaluation with a gender perspective. Thank you, Alejandra. And to end, several people in the public have asked if there are dialogue groups dealing with this topic and how could they get more involved. And I'd like to invite Alejandra Paones to tell us what she thinks. Yes, thank you. What a wonderful, how wonderful to see that there's interest to continue. I'm happy to see that. And in this very space of the G Local conference, you'll be having many panels. There are at least 12 dealing with gender issues from different perspectives, with different panelists and different experiences and initiatives. So, of course, I invite you to look at the G Local agenda and all the initiatives that are in progress this week, and invite you to the relaunching of the Gender Evaluation and Human Rights Group of RELAC. We're going to have an event which we're calling Virtual Coffee. Let's talk about gender equality. And you're all cordially invited to this event on Friday at 4 p.m. Mexico time, 5 p.m. Chilean time, so that you can be part of this actively in the group. We want to relaunch this and invite the new generations of evaluators who have been part of Youth EVA and part of all these institutions. We want this to be a place where we'll revisit some of the gender conceptual and methodologic aspects. We have to continue to deal with that. So there's still a lot of work, and you're all invited to that event at the end of this week of this evaluation week. So let's have a virtual coffee at the end of the week. Thank you very much, Alejandra. Very important to see how we can get more involved in this. And as you were saying, we want to share the two events that are part of the G Local Week so that if you wish, we can focus on a very important topic. We're sharing it in the chat in case you're interested in registering. And to end, I'd like to stress that as evaluators, we have the responsibility and opportunity to contribute to this, insisting that the project include the adequate gender perspective to ensure the rights of all. Thank you all, our panelists, for your contributions, and thank you for participating. And we'll soon be sharing the recordings of this panel in all three languages. Thank you all again, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Gracias, hasta
Gracias.
luego.
Y gracias por compartir con semejantes
Thanks for
paneles.
sharing with such wonderful panelists. Thank you all.